Hello, welcome back to our bookshop in Tring. I'm Ben Morehouse. So we've got another author interview, and we're very lucky to be talking to David Nicholls. David has published books such as One Day and Us and Starter for 10 and The Understudy. Understudy being one of my favourite books of all time. His latest book is Sweet Sorrow. This has just come out in paperback, and it's actually our book of the month as well for September, and we'll be having a book club meeting on that early October. I do hope you enjoyed the interview. He's talking with Jamie Fewery.
And thanks very much, Ben, and welcome back to the Our Bookshop YouTube channel. And this time we're really excited and delighted to be joined by David Nicholls, who is the author of, as everybody knows, Starter for 10, The Understudy, One Day, Us, and most recently, Sweet Sorrow, which is the book we're going to be talking about today. It's just come out in paperback, but as a huge fan of David's work, I've got the hardback here, which I carefully peeled the stickers off from the bookshop that I did buy it from last year. So thank you very much for joining us, David.
Thank you, Jamie. It's very nice to be here. I'm delighted that you're featuring the book. Thank you. There's the paperback. There it is, the pack shot. And
of course, that's going to be Our Bookshop's book of the month for, and the book club choice coming up for September, October. So what would be great, David, if we could start off by just you telling us about Sweet Sorrow and what readers can expect from the novel.
Yes, Sweet Sorrow is in the tradition of the great coming-of-age summer love story. It's set in 1997. It's someone looking back. It's a memory book, you know, in the spirit of The Go-Between or something like that. You know, it's someone looking back at their 16-year-old self. Charlie Lewis, who's left school without qualifications. He doesn't really know what he's going to do with his life. And this long, long, long summer stretching ahead. September is kind of looming at the end of it, and he doesn't know what September holds. So he spends a lot of the summer just going on aimless bike rides, and one day he meets a girl, which is sort of what he's dreaming of, really, a girl called Fran, and they get on, and he wants to see her again, but he discovers to his horror that she is spending the summer putting on a production of Romeo and Juliet, an outdoor amateur production, and he, the only way he can get to see her is to take part. So against his will and against his better judgment, he becomes an actor and takes part in this Amjam production. And the novel is the story of what happens over the course of that summer, told from the point of view of Charlie in the present day, looking back.
And it's a really funny, heartfelt novel, I found, but very different from some of your other books and screenplays and stuff we've seen of yours. So I kind of wanted to start with that, really. That teenage love is very specific type of love, very distinct from married love or dating and the like. What made you want to write about that? It's kind of an intense, very meaningful, very profound kind of love.
I've sort of got into this habit of getting older with my books, really. You know, my first novel, like a lot of first novels, was about, it was a kind of coming of age novel. It was about going to university. That was Starter for 10. Understudy was about someone having a kind of 20-something crisis. And One Day was about characters in their 20s and 30s moving into adulthood and family life. And Us was about marriage and parenthood and love in the 50s, love in middle age. And I didn't want to keep getting older. I thought I should go back to the beginning. So I kind of, I went back to first love as a kind of unique experience, I suppose. As you say, not really like any other romantic relationship you have in your life, because it's the first time you're learning these experiences. You're having these, like learning new colors, you know, you're having these new feelings. And I wanted to write about the kind of gaucheness of it and the painfulness of it and the embarrassment of it. And also the joy of it, you know, the pleasure of it and the thrill of it as well. And so it's a very classic first love story. There's a lot in the novel that sort of plays with the difference between Charlie and Fran's experience of first love, which is tentative and awkward and full of miscommunication, and Romeo and Juliet, you know, which is the great play of first love, where it's a sort of classical notion of love, of Cupid's arrow and love at first sight. And I wanted to put those two different concepts of first love alongside each other and play with the similarities and the differences. But also to try and write truthfully about youth, but from a distance. You know, Start of a 10 is about being 18, which isn't so different, but it's a first-person voice. It's told in the voice of an 18-year-old, and I wanted someone to look back with a certain kind of fond embarrassment at how they used to be, and recognizing how their younger self reflects and also differs from the narrator's current position.
And I think it does that really well. I mean, I was probably around Charlie's age in 1997, and I was growing up in the suburbs, and a lot of my friends were in amateur dramatics groups. So as I was reading it, I was kind of like, oh, God, I recognise so much of this, so much of it. And there's almost, as he looks back, there's the kind of folly of youth, but also a romanticised version of that relationship with Fran. With the Romeo and Juliet thing, was that a deliberate thing, because Charlie and Fran are from very different backgrounds as well, so there was a kind of echo in there as well?
Yeah, I mean, the great dilemma you have in telling a love story is what's stopping these people? You know, I mean, what's just stopping them getting together? And is it the fact they're married? Is it a story of infidelity? What is in Romeo and Juliet, it's almost a kind of abstract idea. There's no real reason for the Montagues and Capulets feud. Almost the first thing you're told in the play is that they're both alike in dignity. They're from the same class. It's just a kind of almost a mythology that keeps the Capulets and the Montagues apart. So in real life, what is it that makes us tentative and awkward around each other? And for Charlie and Fran, it's the issue of education and class in a very particular way. I mean, Fran is not from a wealthy background, but she has a kind of confidence in the world. She has a sense of not entitlement, because that sounds unsympathetic, but she's not sheepish about expressing herself, expressing her feelings, being a performer, about being involved in the world of art, books, whereas Charlie feels rather excluded from that. He feels that it's a different world and it's not for him, and he has no right to be a part of it. So that's the main barrier, really, a kind of a difference of outlook and background that it takes both of them a while to overcome, and perhaps they never really overcome it.
And that feels like it's sometimes manifested in Charlie's friendships, because he's very reticent about when he joins the group, the Full Fathom Five, the drama group on the play. He doesn't want to tell them and doesn't want to explain that he's doing this thing, because it's completely out of their world, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the other big issue is sort of gender identities, and that's a pretentious way of talking about it, but Charlie's notion of what it means to be a boy and later on a man. You know, he has very he has a very close circle of friends, but they're very kind of macho, noisy, boisterous boys who are all a bit self-conscious about expressing themselves and about sincerity and about communicating in anything other than kind of nicknames and aggression. I wanted to write about that kind of slightly toxic form of male friendship, which certainly was very prevalent when I was that age, which wasn't in the 90s, which was way back in the 80s, which sort of still hangs around, I think, a kind of love expressed through hostility, through name-calling, through violence, a kind of weird sort of twisted kind of affection that these boys have for each other that, you know, in some ways is quite touching, but is also tainted with malice and score settling and a kind of misdirected energy and a kind of very fixed notion of what being a boy should involve. And it doesn't involve poetry, you know, it doesn't involve acting or performing or anything that makes you vulnerable or exposes you. That's what Charlie's afraid of, to begin with, at least.
I think it's a very accurate portrayal of that. Thinking back to my adolescence when I was around at that time, I remember when I was reading the book, I was taken back to an English class I had where everyone was invited to bring in a book, and pretty much all the boys brought in the same book, which was Bart Simpson's Guide to Life. It wasn't okay to admit that you liked reading, and I was quite a big reader when I was a kid, and I deliberately did not bring in the book I was reading because I knew it would just be more trouble than it was worth, so I just kept that to one side.
Yeah, I think that stigma does still sort of hang around. I mean, I was the only boy who would do plays. You know, I was the only one. I wasn't like Charlie. I loved being in plays, and because I was the only boy, I got all the best parts. I got this kind of slightly inaccurate notion of my own abilities because there was no one else to cast. So that's why I pursued a career as an actor for a long time, because I was the only boy. I thought I'd be okay. And of course, in the real world, there are other boys who are prepared to be in plays. But yeah, it's a weird thing. I was very bookish, but there was a weird connection made. I mean, I've written about this in the past as well. A weird connection made between reading a book and being posh, you know, being which I never quite understood, that there was something kind of innately snobbish or effeminate or something in having an interest in the written word. Films were just about okay, and music was okay, but books and certainly theatre, you know, there was something a bit taboo about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that point, authors often say there's less of themselves in their books as they write more of them, and they become distanced from their own experience slightly and don't put as much of it into books. Is that true in this case? Because obviously you've had that background in acting and no doubt in amateur dramatics. And did your experiences in that world inform the book in a big way? I know you said it's not you in the book, but how much of yourself did go into it?
I mean, certainly my kind of anxieties and insecurities as a teenager found their way in, because you want the book to be universal, but the circumstances are nothing like mine. You know, Charlie's, we haven't talked about this yet, but Charlie's family is breaking up, and his parents are splitting up very acrimoniously. He's losing touch with his sister. His father is in a depressive, alcoholic slump. None of that was the case in my childhood. I was from a very traditional, you know, 5-person nuclear family. I was much better at school than Charlie. You know, I was a SWAT. You know, I was kind of very obsessed with grades and exams, and very diligent and ambitious. Aspirational, I suppose. I mean, my class background is quite similar to Charlie's, but I was one of the kids in the play. I was one of the kids that Charlie, initially at least, hates. So it was certainly in that respect, I've written away from myself, and I do that quite often consciously. You know, I try to write away from my circumstances, and at the same time, how can you not write your own preoccupations, your own thoughts and feelings? It's always going to find its way onto the page. The trick is, not the trick, but the business of fiction is to disguise it. You know, is to filter it through characters other than yourself, characters with a different worldview and set of experiences, who nevertheless will come up against the issues which obsess you as an author. So it's a strange kind of cocktail fiction and this applies to all fiction, I think, you know, whether it's detective fiction or science fiction. You know, you can't write something that you haven't thought or felt, which doesn't mean you can't write away from yourself and write yourself into the minds and experiences of other people. And
so you mentioned that his family background, the circumstances he's living in at the time. So Sweet Sorrow is ostensibly a love story, but there's a lot more going on beneath the surface of both their lives. How much of that was new ground for you? I know in Us you've written about separation and families coming apart, but yeah, around mental health and that kind of thing of Charlie's father, was that a lot of that new ground for you, writing about different things?
As a subject, yes, it was something that you know, I mean, I thought about it a lot when I was writing Us. My father died when I was writing Us, and so this issue of fathers and sons has been very much in the forefront of my mind for these last 2 books. And when towards the end of Us, there's a section where Douglas, the narrator, says, you know, that a story changes depending on who's telling it. And if this story were to be told by my son, it would be a story of escape, you know, escape from oppression, escape from, you know, kind of coming of age, entering the real world as an adult and an individual. Whereas for Douglas, it's a story of holding on to something, trying to hold a family together. So I suppose that planted the seed for this book in a way, really. You know, if Us is about a father trying to rescue a son, this is about a son who's obliged to rescue a father. And I wanted to try and write quite frankly about depression from the point of view of not the person experiencing it, but the people around them, you know, especially when it's taboo, when it's something that no one's really prepared to call by its name and confront. So I did want to try and write about that authentically and frankly, without dragging down the tone of the book too much, I suppose. You know, I did want it to be a kind of joyous, sunny, summery book, but always with a sense of autumn in the air. You know, always a sense that things can go wrong, that this is a precarious position for Charlie, and a frightening time as well as a joyous time, and that's really provided in the relationship with the father, with whom there's a lot in the book about our inability to communicate. And you know, Shakespeare is all about language, and yet Charlie can't quite find a language to speak to his father. And I wanted that to be the sort of darker, sadder bass note, really, to this much brighter, sunny summer melody.
And it's a very accurate portrayal of how people approach mental health at that time, because I think now I've written about mental health and such like, and in a time where there are lots of conversations about it and people talk about it, it's very much in the agenda of what people discuss. Whereas in the late 90s, it was one of those things where if someone was struggling with something, it would probably not be talked about, or people would not know how to approach it. And particularly in the mind of a young teenage boy, it's almost impossible to broach that subject with a father.
I think that's true. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I wonder why that should be. Perhaps it's to do with social media or just a kind of social evolution. But we are much franker about it. I mean, Prozac was very much a kind of buzzword in the late 90s, and it was something of a taboo. You know, there's this actual acknowledgement that that a large number of people were required medication for a very common debilitating mental condition, and I think we have a much healthier attitude to it now. In the 90s, it wasn't so out there, and certainly wasn't in the 80s when I was a teenager. No one would ever use the word depressed to mean fed up. You know, now it wasn't in the novel. No one really uses the D word. You know, they just say the father's got the blues, or is a bit down, or they relate the condition very much to his circumstances. You know, as soon as he gets a job, as soon as he meets someone, he'll be fine. Well, it isn't as straightforward as that. It's something else. So I wanted to try and get that right, and be frank about it in the novel in the way that no one is frank about it in the world of the novel. Yes,
yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. Talks a bit about characters there and the different people that kind of come into Charlie's world. As any reader of your work will know, you always have these amazing cast of characters who come into the books too. Some of them are sort of slightly comical figures of fun, or slightly almost pathetic figures. I'm always thinking of the stand-up comedian in One Day, but also very well drawn. And in this case, the people I'm drawn to are the drama people in the full Fathom Five. And I'm thinking of Bernard and Polly and where they came from. Were they people you've encountered in your career as an actor, or were they completely plucked out of the air?
I always have to be careful with this one. It's a tricky one. I mean, they're never entirely fictional, but neither are they entirely pen portraits of real life people. Polly, who is playing the nurse and owns the house where they're all putting on this play, has a little trace of someone I know. I don't think has spotted it yet. And I've been in a lot of theatre companies, so you know there's always a certain number of recognizable character traits in any company, and I suppose I've drawn on that a little bit. When I was 18, I just the first summer I was at university, 18 or 19, I did a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream with a theatre company in Kent. As a kind of summer activity, playing Puck, a truly terrible Puck. Even though I haven't really particularly drawn on that experience, there's certain similarities, I suppose, between some of the fictional cast and some of the people I remember from that time. But I try not to do it too much. It makes the whole business of publication a bit nerve-wracking. You know, if you've drawn on all these real life people, especially if you've drawn on them spitefully, I don't think you should ever use a novel or a screenplay as a kind of tool of revenge. It's never going to work out well. So I
No.
try and avoid that.
I accidentally left something in my first book. It was an anecdote about my brother, and it wasn't a spiteful one, it was quite a humorous one. But he read it on honeymoon. He took a photo of the page and texted to me saying, "You've mugged me off here."
I mean, if I still occasionally, one day was full of, there are a couple of things in one day that are real life. And there's a thing about Are You There, Moriarty? There's an awful, terrible, disastrous game of Are You There, Moriarty that happened in real life, not to me, but to someone I know.
Oh, really?
Emma goes for a terrible job interview, and that's real life as well. But I always warn the people in advance that I've stolen their anecdote and acknowledge it at the back of the book.
Perhaps that's what I should have done. As I mentioned, I was growing up around the time that this book is set, so I recognise so much of it. I remember going to an event you did at Cheltenham around the time of Us, where someone asked about the research of Us and how you went about that, to go into all those different countries and have an accurate view of that. With this, you've got an accurate view of a time period and a place and a setting and this kind of suburban town in the 90s and all the cultural references around that. How did you go about taking yourself back there? Was it a case of reading around it, or do you use memory, or?
Primarily, it's about omission rather than research. You know, it's just about recognizing that a mobile phone was quite an exciting thing to pull out of your pocket in '97, and also to recognizing, I think the biggest mistake people make, both on film and in books, when they're trying to capture time, is just slathering it on. You know, the idea that at any given period of time, the only music you listen to is from that date. It's nonsense. You know, we all listen to old music all the time. It's not about, you know, so 97 can be as much about Nina Simone and the Velvet Underground as it can be about Oasis and Blur. You know, you have to, other things are in the air. And I have a pretty good cultural memory. And music is a big part of that. You know, I will check not so much the charts, you know, not to just bang in lots of Spice Girls, but try and recall what we were all listening to that wasn't necessarily from that particular date, and what we were watching and what the obsessions were, and occasionally I'll do a little Google search as to, you know, Fran. I had to do a lot of questioning of friends slightly younger than myself about what would be played at a school disco in '97, and what Fran would be wearing, what particular brand of Adidas sneakers. But I remember everyone wearing those denim skirts that were made out of a pair of jeans. And the one that I did have to do a little bit of Googling about was scent. You know, I remember Gap, there being a kind of Gap body spray that smelled of grass in a very chemical, uncanny way. And that makes a little cameo. But you have to be quite sparing, I think. When I wrote One Day, because I wanted One Day to be like very vivid recollection of each of these years, I did a lot of this. And the first drafts were kind of just stacked with cultural references. And I think it's important just to go through and scribble them out, really. And just let the reader do the work. I mean, people with Sweet Sorrow talked a lot about how nostalgic it is and how it's brought it all back and how it's made them go back through their record collection. But if you go through the text and look for specific references to contemporary songs, there's only 3 or 4, you know, there are very few. I think the hope is that the reader is filling in those gaps, is dressing the characters. I mean, after all, novelists don't describe what everyone is wearing. So if you have a visual sense of what a character is wearing, chances are you provided it yourself as a reader. And as a novelist, you have to trust that the reader will do that.
And I suppose everyone's going to have their own quite distinct recollection of that time period. For me, it was growing up, and for other people, it will be, you know, my mum read this book, she will be thinking about it as me as her son and watching me grow up and that kind of thing. So cultural references will be similar, but remembered very differently.
The thing that I have done differently in this book is that with with us, the last book, I was very, very specific about every street corner, about every view, about every restaurant menu, the train timetables worked. You know, it was a novel that you could follow like an itinerary. I mean, you could be in every single location that Douglas finds himself in. With this book, it's a kind of the town is never named. You know, it's I sort of know where it is, but I haven't gone there and researched and taken photographs, which is what I'd usually do. It's a kind of every town. And again, you trust the reader to provide their own geographical details, but you kind of know what the high street feels like. You kind of know the slightly depressing, you know, industrial estate at the edge of town and the bridge that goes over the ring road. And you can provide all that yourself. So this is the first time I've written about a more abstract, fictional England, and also the first time I've written about the countryside. You know, all of my other books have been very urban, and this one I wanted it to be like a Shakespeare play when the characters go into the country and the mood changes. You know, that this Charlie going into the countryside is a little bit like the characters in As You Like It going into the forest. It becomes a different kind of story.
Yeah, I think for me it was very squarely Watford and the countryside shortly around Watford, which is where I grew up from, where I am now, in fact, as well, not too far from. So talking about Us again there, I remember at the time you talked about the writing experience of Us and various challenges that you had around that, and discarding a large chunk of a first draft of what later became Us. How was the writing experience of Sweet Sorrow compared to that? Was it smoother? Was it a more fluid process? Did you find yourself challenged as much?
It was a different approach. I mean, the terrible thing about writing a book is it doesn't tell you how to write the next book. You know, every book has been written for me in an entirely different way. With this, I had a mood in my mind. You know, I wanted it to be long summer days, that sense of the end of summer, a kind of bottle of cider at a teenage party, you know, while it's still light outside. There's a song by Pulp, which I'm quoting, called David's Last Summer, and that's exactly about one of those teenage summers where a love affair begins and ends within the course of the 3 months. And I wanted it to have an atmosphere. And so I had almost a kind of mood board, a document called September, which I filled in over the course of about 18 months. And then I had to put it to one side because Patrick Melrose, the screenplays I'd been writing, went into production, and I couldn't really write fiction. It was too intense, too frightening, and too much going on. So I put it to one side, and then I went back to it and compiled everything I had and took out the bits that I loved, the character sketches I liked. I knew that I was going to write about putting on a play. I knew that it was going to be set in the 90s. I knew that it was going to take place over the course of a summer, and I knew that it was going to be told from the present day looking back. So I had those elements to it, but I thought it was going to be a much shorter novel. I thought it was almost going to be a two-hander, and it would just be dialogue, teenagers talking to each other. And then I realized that actually you have to give some background, and if you're putting on a play, you need a cast of characters, and pretty soon it started to expand a little bit to what it currently is now, which is something of an epic, you know, with about more named characters than any book I've written, I think, about 25 significant named characters. And I didn't expect that. So certain things will change as you start the process.
Yeah, I noticed that when I was reading it. The other books I've read of yours have been, you say, almost two-handers or intensely focused on one relationship or one person even, and their relationship that spin off around them. Whereas this one had the central relationship and then all these other people that floated around them that had different influences on the characters as well.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, you have to have a theatre company. You know, if you're going to choose Midsummer Stream, Romeo and Juliet, someone's got to play Lady Montague. So you have to decide who that is, and you have to do it very deftly, you know, very, very economically, and so that the reader gets a little idea if they are, even if they're never going to enter their consciousness or follow that particular storyline. So it's about very concise pencil sketches that are nevertheless vivid enough for the reader to carry it through the novel.
Yeah. So as well as reading Sweet Sorrow this autumn, people will be able to watch the TV adaptation of Us, which has just had the first trailer released for it this week. Did you adapt your own novel again for this one?
I did, yes, I did. And it was, as always, very, very hard. You know, I always swear that I won't do it, and then I always find the idea of someone else doing it just too difficult. So that's coming out in, well, I can't say exactly, but very soon. Yeah, and again, it's not intentional. I mean, it's slightly disastrous, really. We were filming Us while I was on the road doing publicity for Sweet Sorrow, and it was a long publicity tour. So I barely went on set for Us, but I did at the end of each day, you know, provide my rewrites and watch the rushes and all of that. But I sort of did it remotely. So yeah, it was an intense summer, but it's really good, I think. And it'll be on Sunday night BBC very soon.
And that'll give people a great way to kind of travel around Europe when they're not allowed to travel around Europe.
Yes, it was originally going to go out in May. And then, of course, lockdown happened and we couldn't quite, we were just a week away from finishing it. But the things that we had to do, doing the final bits of voiceover and ADR, where you add little bits of dialogue recording and grading it so that all of the scenes have the same kind of color palette. All of those things, we really had to be in the same room, which is something we weren't allowed to do all of a sudden. So we had to put it on hold. But if it had gone out in May, I think it would have felt almost maddening, because it's about very free and easy travel through Europe. And it's a very intense, intimate, close-up drama. So I think now, hopefully, it will fulfill a kind of travelogue role, as well as providing, you know, a good, funny, sad, emotional family drama.
I'm very much looking forward to it. And before we let you go, the question that I think every David Nicholls reader wants to know the answer to is what's next, and can we expect a new book soon, or more screenplays and adaptations?
No, I'm afraid I'm going to disappear now for a long time. I mean, I don't have an idea for a novel, and if I do, even if I get one, it'll take a good couple of years to prepare, to get right, to get out. So everything, all of the scripts I've written that are going to happen have happened. So nothing for 4 or 5 years, I'm afraid. That's it. I'm going to be very quiet for a while, which is fine, because the last little run from publication of Us through Melrose and Sweet Sorrow and now Us on TV has been very intense. So I feel like I need to just have a little recharge. And also Sweet Sorrow also feels like a bit of an end of a chapter, really. I've written these 3 novels which are about love at different times of our lives, and characters aging from 16 all the way up to 56, and lots of stuff about time and different periods of recent history. And I'm going to put all of that to one side and try and write a different kind of book. That's the theory anyway. It'll probably just be the same characters and jokes, but I just need to take a little step back for a while. So it's going to be a while, I'm afraid.
Oh, well, we'll look forward to whatever it happens to be. But for now, I'll say thank you very much, David, again, for joining us. And just a reminder that Sweet Sorrow is available at Our Bookshop in Tring.
Thanks very much.
Back to you, Ben.
Huge thanks to David and Jamie for that wonderful interview. Sweet Sorrow is our book club book of the month for this month, September. And first Monday of October, we'll be having a collective book club meeting, and David Nicholls has offered to join us for that. So get the book from us and you can join that Zoom meeting. All the purchase blurb is available in the text below this, or give us a call on 01442 827 653. Loads more author interviews to come. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll see you very soon.